There's a modern word for cruel or unjust regimes who glamorise themselves or cleanse their image through association with football, and the modern word is sports washing. The laundering of an image through being associated with sport.
Sports washing. At its core, sports washing thrives on the power of sport to captivate a large audience, forging and defining communities. By pouring resources into high-profile events, governments get to bask in the limelight and paint their countries as open and progressive. Basically, Saudi Arabia and other countries that engage in sports washing are trying to distract people from the things they've done.
The term sports washing is one that's relatively new to Americans, but it's been going on for quite some time, specifically as it relates to countries like Saudi Arabia. Explain what it is and how it affects sports there.
The 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
The Qatar World Cup should never have happened. FIFA and Qatar were both aware of the loss of life that would result from the confluence of poor working conditions and extreme heat with an exploited class of migrant labourers. Government estimates, as reported in The Guardian, suggest at least 6,500 migrant workers died in the process of construction for the World Cup. This is unacceptable, of course, but the way the Western press is so universally offended is a little confusing. Oh, the poor migrant workers, forced to do the bidding of a powerful regime to prop up the society of a wealthy elite.
Oh, unknowable universe!
Just imagine, a society where all the material products were produced by cheap foreign labour, working in inadequate conditions with insufficient working rights. I know it's challenging to even conceive of such a reality, since we in the West obviously managed to perfect the ancient esoteric science of alchemy, and can now produce exploitation-free consumer goods. We all know this, but just for fun, let's try and imagine we still lived in a world where demand for third world natural resources led to a process of exploitation of labourers in the global south, where child labour is an accepted practice for the mining of these resources, and where the profits generated from the material products of these resources accumulate in the hands of a Western ruling class. And when one of the most iconic and powerful Western companies profiting from child labour resource extraction is investigated for its involvement in this practice, they then pay for an article to appear in The Guardian, the same outlet that reported the death toll of figures of migrant workers in Qatar, making the case that child labour isn't so bad actually, so long as it's in Africa. But if this were all true, and it was a good thing for children and adult workers in the global south to be producing stuff for us in the global north in harsh conditions for low wages, then shouldn't it also be a good thing for Qatar to be making use of a migrant labour force who maybe just want to learn a thing or two about this funny old business we call life, huh? You may see exploitation here, but I see a valuable opportunity for self-improvement. Or, if we think exploitation of cheap foreign labour markets is a bad thing, then why are we so focused on Qatar's labour abuses? What this tendency in Western media to emphasise the human rights abuses in non-Western states is suggestive of is what Clifford Bob calls rights as weapons, where human rights aren't actually some universal standards of good, but are instead deployed strategically against competing interests. Human rights as the concept is understood today in the West emerged during the Enlightenment and are often attributed in large part to the thought of John Locke. John Locke, philosopher and partisan of his day, stressed the right to property in lives, liberties, and estates. He did so not only to weaken the British monarchy, but also to increase the political power of the landed gentry and middle classes against propertyless Britons who also demanded rights. So what Bob is pointing to here is that John Locke used the right to private property to leverage the power of certain propertied classes over the British monarchy, while maintaining a propertyless underclass who would now be subservient to the demands of those who owned property. This dynamic of using a right to justify power over other groups, Zizek argues, is the predominant way human rights discourse is deployed in the West when talking about global contexts. What the human rights of third world suffering victims effectively means today in the predominant discourse is the right of Western powers themselves to intervene politically, economically, culturally, and militarily in the third world countries of their choice, in the name of defending human rights. Cast your minds back to 2003. 50 Cent has just debuted with In Da Club, an absolute banger. Also, America has failed to convince the international community of the legitimacy of its aims to invade Iraq.
Many around the world oppose this conflict.
George Bush gives a speech framing the mission in the language of defending the oppressed people of a third world nation.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
Yes, the very honourable spirit of the American military liberated the oppressed people of Iraq. This is what Zizek and Clifford Bob identify as a phenomenon of essentially human rights as imperialism. To claim your interference in a country's affairs is on behalf of liberating the oppressed people within that country. Joseph Nye, an American international relations theorist, coined the term soft power in 1990. It is the ability to get what you want through attraction, rather than coercion or payments. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. When our policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others, our soft power is enhanced. In the context of the Iraq War, the American military was the hard power arm of the process, using force and coercion to carry out US interests. The soft power was in the projection of the legitimacy of this process, with appeals to political ideals of defending human rights and the spread of democratic policies.
Great news, everybody! Democracy just kicked in!
Joseph Nye, writing the year after the invasion, notes that American soft power declined, with opinion polls in most countries showing less favourable views of America than before the war. While the US was still broadly admired for its Hollywood entertainment, elite universities, and other cultural aspects of soft power, its perception as an upholder of international norms and values was greatly diminished. To address these criticisms of American imperial overreach, Nye suggests the possibility for correcting this view exists with a successful outcome in Iraq. The legitimacy of American actions will be accepted after the fact if we produce a better Iraq. Such post hoc legitimization may help to restore American soft power that was lost on the way in. The neoconservatives believed that American power could be used to export democracy to Iraq and transform the politics of the Middle East. If successful, the war would become self-legitimizing. As William Kristol and Lawrence Kaplan put it, what is wrong with dominance in the service of sound principles and high ideals? I think the legacy of the Iraq invasion provides the answer to that question.
The honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
This post hoc legitimization, though, I think is very relevant in the case of Qatar and their public relations effort to earn soft power legitimacy through the hosting of the World Cup. While researching for this video, I came across an article in an open access journal titled Channeling Soft Power, the Qatar 2022 World Cup, Migrant Workers and International Image. Sounds relevant. Only about halfway through though, I realised the author's name, Mohammed Al Thani, as in the Al Thani royal family of Qatar. Amazingly, the author declared no conflict of interest. I found that quite amusing, but also the article does provide quite interesting insight into the PR approach of Qatar to build their soft power legitimacy. While Qatar conceptualizes the 2022 World Cup as an opportunity to enhance its soft power and augment its national pride, mega sporting events in general have been historically linked with human rights concerns relating to the welfare of low-skilled laborers. It is worth noting that some nations outside Europe, such as China, Russia, and Brazil, who have hosted mega sporting events, have been criticized for their suppression of investigations by journalists and activists. Thus, one can surmise that Qatar is following a different path from that of nations who have repressed human rights concerns by showcasing that the Qatari government is open to dialogue and willing to update domestic policies to conventional global standards. So the approach that Qataris were looking to take was one quite similar to some of America's justifications for the war in Iraq. The reputational damage from the increased scrutiny on the labour rights of migrant workers could be absorbed in the short term, and a perception that Qatar would then use this as an opportunity to better the rights of migrant workers would be the post hoc justification for the human rights abuses necessary to host the World Cup in the first place. If sports washing is, as Archer et al. Say in their article Sports Washing, Complicity and Corruption, a valuable strategic vehicle for navigating the fundamental dynamic between a moral violation and the desire for that violation not to be attended to by others, then this was not that. Qatar was not looking for a way to cover up its human rights abuses. Soyland and Morricone write in International Area Studies Review, when Qatar won the bid to host the 2022 World Cup in December 2010, it sent shockwaves through the entire sporting world. Until then, Qatar had been a largely unknown entity in world affairs. The abuses of the kafala labor system are not new, but they only entered the international agenda when they were related to infrastructures being built for the World Cup. Absolutely no one cared about human rights abuses in Qatar prior to 2010, or they were not widely disseminated at least, and Qatar in general had a very low public profile. This was not an attempt to hide or obscure some moral evil that was a part of their reputation, because they barely even had a reputation. This was an attempt to build soft power, with the intention of attracting business investment and gaining greater integration into the world economy. And for better or worse, everyone knows about Qatar now. They were aware human rights abuses would become a media focus, and this was just a PR side quest they had to deal with. The main goal is to build soft power. For what was quite a sophisticated understanding of public and international relations, Qatar did commit one serious strategic blunder that they should have been prepared for. Pissing off the Americans.
We knew that the United States was, the front runner. We recognized that.
America was the favored bid to host the 2022 World Cup. Bill Clinton was enjoying his re-emergence into public diplomacy, with a decade between his scandalous second term in office. He'd been swanning around, charming delegates into voting for the US bid, but it didn't go to plan.
The winner to organize the 22 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
Bill Clinton was reportedly so angry he smashed a mirror in his hotel suite. An FBI investigation was launched, culminating in arrests of FIFA officials over corruption. FIFA is absolutely a criminally corrupt organization. However, the real problem with this fact for the US is it means they are less able to get their own way. You see, when it comes to international institutions, the US is very used to getting its own way. They are the controlling powers in the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. These institutions will represent American interests in the global economy. For an example, the 1978 World Cup in Argentina is often cited as a historical case of sports washing. The previous ruling coalition, the Social Democratic Peronists, had been ousted in a coup in 1976 that established a military junta in control of the country. Prior to the coup, Argentina had been dealing with an economic crisis and they needed relief payments from the IMF. The IMF, though, was not forthcoming on a previously negotiated round of relief, even after a number of trips to Washington by Argentinian diplomats. The economic crisis greatly hindered the legitimacy of the Peronist establishment, allowing the possibility for the military to take charge. Just 1 week after the coup, the IMF loaned the military dictatorship $100 million, followed a few months later by a further $260 million. This was the largest loan to a Latin American country at the time. The military junta had been willing to implement the IMF's neoliberal agenda of privatization and opening up the economy to foreign capital that the previous democratic administration had resisted. Thus, US interests, represented by a proxy of the IMF, were more aligned with an authoritarian military regime who would grant American corporations greater access to the profits of Argentinian production. Concerns over human rights in Argentina under the military dictatorship started to receive attention in the West. Then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, however, wasn't super keen on the idea of human rights. In declassified documents, he told the Argentine military leadership that the US wanted them to succeed and to get all the human rights abuses out of the way quickly before Congress had a chance to do anything about it. Approximately 30,000 people were killed under the dictatorship. So what this exemplifies is international institutions such as the IMF are tools of American hard power to coerce governments into implementing neoliberal reforms that favor US corporations, withholding loans when necessary, and supplying loans to brutal dictatorships when necessary. The fact that FIFA cannot be relied on in this way to be a tool of American soft power is an insult to their position as the economic hegemon. Although it should be noted in this case that while the Argentine military junta is usually the focus of sports washing claims, the US and the IMF actively supported the military junta. And so FIFA, by elevating the legitimacy of the Argentine military, was acting in accordance with the interests of US foreign policy. The same is true for FIFA's backing of the Chilean military dictatorship in 1973, over protestations from the Soviet Union. After a 0-0 draw in Moscow during World Cup qualification, the return leg was set to be played in Chile. According to the New York Times, Moscow balked at playing in a stadium that it said had been turned by the military junta into an arena of torture and execution of patriots who supported the late President Salvador Allende. Prisoners were removed from the stadium only last week. The military, led by Augusto Pinochet and backed by the US, overthrew a democratically elected socialist, Salvador Allende, in a violent coup. The Soviet Union, being naturally very sympathetic to the Allende government, said, "Hey, we feel a bit weird about playing football in a stadium you were literally torturing and executing people in last week. Seems reasonable." FIFA then disqualified the Soviet Union, and Chile won the match, scoring into an empty net. So again, another example of FIFA backing an authoritarian neoliberal US-supported regime, elevating their soft power legitimacy on the world stage. In recent times, emphasis has been placed on FIFA's support for authoritarian or illiberal regimes that are opposed to Western interests, but there are certainly cases where FIFA has supported authoritarian Western-backed interests in the past, even going against the interests of the main antagonist to the West, the Soviet Union. Anyway, the point is, the US likes international organizations to represent their interests, as any superpower would. Perhaps both Qatar and FIFA could have exercised more caution. Qatar could have refrained from bidding on 2022, leave the door open for America, and bid on 2026. It probably could have avoided a lot of heat that way. In talking about sports washing, Qatar is often lumped in with the sporting involvement of fellow Gulf state, Saudi Arabia. If sports washing is the use of sports to hide or obfuscate human rights abuses, then I still don't view Saudi Arabia's purchase of Newcastle United as primarily a function of sports washing, though there is definitely a stronger case to be made against the Saudis than the Qataris. Unlike Qatar, Saudi Arabia's human rights record actually has been the subject of significant discourse prior to any involvement in sporting investments. The high-profile murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the oppression of women and LGBTQ people, and the devastating war on Yemen which has killed hundreds of thousands of people. A war which, it should be said, Western states share in a level of complicity, having sold Saudi the bombs they drop on their neighbour. It probably is fair to suggest the Saudi government will be using their strategic sporting associations to distract from these controversial areas. However, this is not the overarching reason for them to be investing in sports. Both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have devised their own 2030 development plans to have their economies diversified and integrated into the global market by 2030. Both states owe their enormous wealth to oil, a finite resource that the world may, at some stage, consider thinking about the possibility of beginning to move away from in favour of renewables. Both states understand the level of revenue they currently generate is not sustainable without big changes. This is why you see weird Saudi projects like NEOM and the Macabre, futuristic infrastructure with westernized consumer activities like retail, cinema, sporting events all in one location. They understand they need to transform their economies from a reliance on oil into one that can attract business investment, tourism, and respect from the West. Again, like with Qatar, Saudi Arabia is trying to build up its soft power, trying to be an attractive proposition to the Western world to ensure its own survival once we hopefully reach a post-oil society. Distracting from human rights abuses plays a part in this dynamic, but to claim that sports washing is the primary function here is deluded. It's a Western framing of the narrative that contends the only relevant fact about a state like Saudi Arabia is its human rights abuses, while Western countries' human rights abuses are totally irrelevant to their involvement in sport. Archer et al. Write, "Participants in sports can become complicit in these injustices by aiding sports washing which allows these injustices to continue. By normalizing wrongdoing, sports washing seems to morally corrupt the fans too. It misleads fans into approving of something that they should abhor." Whether or not you agree that, say, Newcastle fans are complicit in the human rights abuses committed by the Saudis doesn't really matter for now, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that they are complicit, by enjoying the benefits the club receive as a result of Saudi ownership. There is no logical basis to argue that your complicity is strictly confined to states like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. If you're complicit in one area of wrongdoing, you're complicit in absolutely every area of the world economy that you participate in, and the subsequent human rights abuses. Every item of clothing you own, every technological purchase you make. Everything is produced by exploitative conditions, the appropriation of third world natural resources, and unsatisfactory foreign labour standards maintained in collusion with the interests of Western capital. If you're complicit in the abuses perpetuated by the ownership of the club that you support, then you're absolutely complicit in every rights violation committed by Western governments and corporations when you buy their products or benefit from their actions indirectly. Sports washing discourse, however, is clearly committed to keeping you focused on the rights abuses of non-Western states. A seldom acknowledged element of sports washing discourse, as Michael Ski points out, is that sports washing is rarely, if ever, used outside discussions of the activities of non-Western states. The Women's World Cup is set to be hosted by Australia and New Zealand.
First time, Australia has recognised the legal existence of Aborigines prior to white settlement. European settlement of Australia was based on the premise of terra nullius, which basically means no person's land. Now, more than 2 centuries later, the High Court has recognised there were people here and their descendants have rights.
The tournament in Australia is actually being played on stolen land. As much of a human rights violation as general colonisation of a land is, Australia manages to surpass the usual moral objections to this process. For a state to claim sovereignty over a new land, a treaty or series of treaties must be signed between the invaders and the natives that establishes the invaders as the lawful rulers. As weird and seemingly unfair a process as that already is for an imperial force with far greater power to demand legitimacy to take your land from you, Australia just never did that. New Zealand, Canada, even the US have treaties between their governments and indigenous people. While obviously this in effect still grants greater socioeconomic power to the group represented by the colonizers, and the colonized remain marginalized, there are usually at least some protections involved for the indigenous people. Australians were just so busy being relaxed and easygoing they never got around to it. They took the land and never entered a process of legal reconciliation, which legally means the Aboriginal people never ceded their sovereignty.
I might argue the point with you. I'm Indigenous. I was born here. I'm native to the land. So, you know, I'm Australian as well, and I'm Indigenous as well. So I think any part of Australia is very
doubtful look on your face. Why do you look so doubtful?
She's Indigenous.
Yes, I am. Do you know the word Indigenous?
Yeah, I do.
Native to the land. I was born here. Where's my land if it's not Australia?
England?
England is exactly the correct response. The settler colonial society that privileges the descendants of European colonization is in fact occupying the land illegally. If you want to talk about complicity, surely every white Australian is in some sense complicit in the theft of Aboriginal land. The indigenous population is also subject to oppression via systematically enforced white supremacy. Numerous exposés have failed to close any youth detention centres in the Northern Territory that terrorise Aboriginal kids.
How were the boys in there?
The immediate image that comes to my mind is Abu Ghraib.
CCTV shows Jake Roper in a spit hood being returned to Don Dale the next morning. His feet are full of glass and his wrists are sore from the shackles. He's left alone in isolation again. I'm sorry, are we in Australia here? Where else is this happening in the world where children are treated like this? Vulnerable children?
Caro, I would certainly say this. I don't believe it's happening anywhere else in the developed world.
The Northern Territory intervention of 2007 was a cynically deployed land grab that stripped Aboriginal people of some very modest rights to control of native land, all in the service of mining companies who needed access to sweet minerals buried under the ground. Part of the criticism levied against Gulf states involved in sport is focused on their wealth generated from the fossil fuel industry. Well, Australia's largest export is...
coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal that has ensured for over 100 years
the Deputy Prime
Australia
Minister
has enjoyed an energy competitive advantage that has delivered prosperity to Australian businesses and has ensured that Australian industry has been able to remain competitive on a global market. Mr. Speaker, those opposite have an ideological, pathological fear of coal. There's no word for coalophobia officially, Mr. Speaker, but that's the malady that afflicts those opposite.
Coal mined from land that doesn't belong to them, and the profits of which absolutely do not flow to the rightful owners of the land. I just think that maybe, after all the media hyperventilation over the Qatar World Cup, that someone, somewhere, could say something in the global media that draws attention to Australia's history of colonisation and oppression of Indigenous people. Is that really too much to ask? We don't need to label them sports washers. Australia, just like Qatar, just like Saudi Arabia, is primarily hosting the tournament for soft power results. But if we're going to apply such intense scrutiny to one host state's human rights record, then there needs to be consistency and scrutiny applied to all host states, including Western ones. And so this brings us back to America. After being jilted for 2022, they were granted host status in a joint bid alongside Mexico and Canada for 2026. After the Qatar World Cup, it would seem a precedent has been set for media scrutiny over the host state's record on human rights. So we're gonna see a media offensive on the global superpower's problematic rights record, right? Probably not. There is at present though the possibility that this man is back in charge in time to host the tournament, which would give the liberal press an easier angle to criticise Trump specifically as sports washing his own corruption, and any policies they can attribute to his administration without tarring the US as a whole. But don't let the Trump smokescreen distract from the very real problems of the American establishment. A Gallup poll taken in 2013, prime Obama years, found that the US was seen around the world as the greatest threat to world peace. In 2021, a year after liberal order was restored, a poll of 50,000 people in 53 countries revealed the US was seen as the country that represented the biggest threat to democracy in the world.
And those who bet against America are learning how wrong they are. It's never, ever been a good bet to bet against America. Never. Well,
this was of course a year before Russia invaded Ukraine, so those views could for sure have shifted, but not through virtue of the US actually rectifying any of the reasons that people view them as a threat to their own state's sovereignty and self-determination.
Today marks 60 years of the full U.S. trade embargo on Cuba. Signed into law by President Kennedy, the sanctions were strengthened by President Trump.
The economic embargo that the US has imposed on Cuba prevents Cuba from full participation in the global economy.
The world's longest economic embargo has certainly hurt ordinary Cubans, limiting access to medicine, cheap US imports, technology and credit through a US dollar-dominated financial system. Washington's purpose has always been to modify or force out Cuba's one-party communist system, but clearly it's failed miserably.
The economic stranglehold on the country leaves Cuban people with no real hope for economic prosperity. Despite this, the country is consistently ranked towards the front of the pack of Latin American states on health outcomes and healthcare system performance, and is ranked in close proximity to the US, the world's richest economy. The embargo was placed on Cuba after the socialist revolution led by Fidel Castro ended a status quo of the Cuban economy being run with the aim of benefiting the interests of US capital. Although the years of US occupation were short, the US used them to ensure the Cuban economy would remain dependent upon the United States, initially through ownership of the sugar industry, but then more importantly through the openness of the Cuban economy to US capital and investment. Continued US influence ensured that successive Cuban governments did not challenge this relationship of subservience, or attempt to change the nature of the economy. Although elections were held in this period, their outcomes were subject to US approval. Now, whatever you might think of Fidel Castro, I think he's a G, but even if you hate him, there is something you should remember. Fidel Castro is dead. The Soviet Union died 30 years ago. The Cold War is over. Move on and let Cuba live normally. Since the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the UN General Assembly has held a vote every year on the Cuban embargo. And every single year, the UN has voted in favour of ending the embargo. In recent years, every single country except for the US and Israel have voted for the US to end the embargo. And every single year, the US in response says,
Fuck off. Fuck off. Fuck off. Fuck off. Fuck off.
There aren't many things that could unite every single country in the world, but ending the Cuban embargo is one of them.
New World Order.
The continuation of the policy has ramifications for the efficacy of international law. Its maintenance over 5 decades appears almost exclusively a matter of ideology and politics. The punishment seems to be the wrongful act, which has not been curbed or fully confronted by the rest of the world. Indeed, the continuing act of apparently illegitimate coercion becomes the norm, making it very difficult to identify when sanctions are lawful or not. Ideologically motivated economic coercion that subjects 11 million Cubans to arbitrarily enforced poverty, undermines the legitimacy of international law, and defies the wishes of every other country in the world. And yet somehow it's not even the biggest human rights abuse on the island, because guess what else is there?
Guantanamo Bay, a 116 square kilometre pocket of America on the edge of Cuba.
We're on Bravo Block, typical outdoor camp that has 48 cells in it with the green color chosen for its soothing aspect.
The Cuban government is not a perfect institution. There are, of course, problems of governance and corruption, but until the economic blockade is lifted, it's very hard to place any blame on the government for Cuba's struggling economy. Even in the context of the blockade, the Cuban government still provides health outcomes on a par with the US. And if every other country in the world got their way and were allowed to freely trade with Cuba, you can only imagine the economy would get a lot better. And until Guantanamo Bay is gone, any concerns for the democratic rights of Cuban citizens to organize or dissent against the Cuban government carry very little weight when the leader of the free world carries out unlawful detention without trial on Cuban soil and has historically subjected detainees to torture, many of whom were totally innocent. The Qatar World Cup, I'll say again, shouldn't have happened. 6,500 people should not have to die for the tournament to take place. The US, already having the necessary infrastructure, will not have people die in the process. But the allegations of sports washing against Qatar were not limited to the worker deaths or poor labour standards. They became a holistic critique of the state. So if we can focus on legitimate human rights concerns beyond those necessary to host the tournament, then I think there's quite a lot to critique the US for. How many people did they kill in the illegal war in Iraq? How many inmates are detained without trial at Guantanamo Bay? How many people do their police kill every year? How many of their citizens are imprisoned? How many foreign governments have they overthrown? How many foreign populations have been subjected to neoliberal economic policies that extract profits from their countries to US corporations? How many Americans are killed in mass shootings? How many people can't afford life-saving medical coverage? How many trillions of dollars of profits do their corporations make from exploited third world labor? What percentage of their media spends every hour of the day spewing vile hatred towards minorities? How many women do they deny abortions to? How can we ever hope to transition to renewable energy when their corporate interests promote climate denial at every turn? Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised and be made to look a complete fool in 3 years when the media labels the US a sports washing state, using a mega sporting event to cover up a history of human rights abuses. But given the media's reluctance to attribute the term sports washing or focus on the human rights abuses of Western nations in connection with sporting affiliation, it seems unlikely. Anthropologist Arian Akisa has written of human rights discourse as a strategy of hegemonic distinction between the West and Islamic societies. New human rights norms are continually produced and subverted by liberal elites in the West. Because these norms are constantly evolving, Muslim social practices can never catch up to them. This produces a perpetual distinction between a progressive liberal Occident and a backwards illiberal Orient, justifying the perpetual hegemony of the former over the latter. For an example of this dynamic whereby Western interests can take advantage of the Western world being a step ahead of the Islamic world on human rights, let's look to a prestigious outlet of journalistic integrity, the Daily Mail. Here is a story the Daily Mail wrote about a transgender Qatari princess who sought asylum in the UK. The article describes a situation in which the princess was unable to live freely in their own identity, in a repressive society where gender transitions are illegal. Transgenderism is treated in the article with neutral, even respectful language, with the target of the judgment being the repressive, illiberal Qatari state. Now let's look at how the Daily Mail more typically reports on transgender-related news. As you can see, and we're probably already aware, the Daily Mail is a reliable source of transphobia in the British media, contributing to an atmosphere of hostility, aggression, and humiliation of people based on their gender identity. In this way, bigoted establishment media outlets can have their cake and eat it too. Today, the Daily Mail feels like attacking trans people. The next day, they feel like attacking a non-Western state for their attacks on trans people.
Today I feel gay.
Free to spout ignorance and ugliness on a daily basis, but then take advantage of the perception of the West as living by higher ideals than the Muslim world, so as to be able to conceal their bigotry in the service of highlighting the bigotry of a competing ideological persuasion. There's also a great example from a Chinese context of this continual shifting of human rights norms that keeps the East always playing catch up to the West. China's involvement in hosting mega sporting events often leads to scrutiny over the discrimination of LGBTQ people. In the book Passions of the Cut Sleeve, A History of Homosexuality in China, Brett Hinch demonstrates a very long history of Chinese same-sex relationships as being an accepted part of Chinese society. The book's title takes its name from a Chinese folktale of an emperor who, after sleeping with his male lover, wakes up and needs to leave, but his shirt sleeve is caught under his lover's sleeping body. Rather than wake him, the emperor cuts off his sleeve so he can leave his lover in peace. Now that's an objectively sweet story. If there was a folk tale from medieval England about two male lovers, I don't think the tone would be quite so sweet, and a very different appendage may be getting cut off.
I gotta get my dick sewn back on. That's not funny. Is that it? What? Ah! That's my dick! Pick up my dick, please! No, we're not picking up your dick. Fucking pick my dick up!
Brett Hinch writes, "Many times homosexuality acted as an integral part of society, complete with same-sex marriages for both men and women. It spanned a range of social classes from famed emperors and aristocrats to impoverished labourers. When Western travellers first described Chinese society to their fellow Europeans, they lavished ecstatic praise on many aspects of Chinese culture. But one aspect of Chinese society received strident condemnation and scorn: homosexuality. The words of hostile Europeans reveal how travellers from the West were quick to divide the world into a morally virtuous Occident superior to what they saw as the exotic decadence of the Orient. A sense of tradition lasted up until this century, when it fell victim to a growing sexual conservatism and the westernization of morality. After a long history of same-sex acceptance, European imperialism had plundered China in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the export of Christian morality that prohibited same-sex relations became crystallized in the Chinese context. China under Mao pushed out imperial forces and reclaimed China for the Chinese, but the previous toleration for homosexuality did not resurface. Brett Hinch was writing this book in the early 90s, not long after the AIDS crisis. Homophobia was extremely prevalent in the West at the time. The rights of LGBTQ people did have a rather rapid expansion over the next 2 to 3 decades, with legal protections and the extension of marriage as an institution to same-sex couples. But I think it's worth remembering just how recently in the grand scheme of things, Western society was grossly intolerant of non-heteronormative orientations. Obviously, anti-queer values are still very prevalent, being strongly pushed by right-wing media, and this is still an unsafe time for many LGBTQ people. But even mainstream liberal politicians would not voice support for gay marriage until around the last decade or so.
I believe that marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman. That it exists between a man and a woman going back into the mists of history as one of the foundational institutions of history and humanity and civilization.
Let's try to avoid nuance, Senator.
Do you support
gay marriage?
No, Barack Obama nor I support redefining from a civil side what constitutes marriage.
Your question to him was whether he supported gay marriage, and my answer is the same as his, and it is that I do not.
Wonderful, you agree. On that note, let's move to foreign policy.
Okay.
You can say in defense of the liberal establishment that maybe there were political realities that prevented them speaking in favor of same-sex marriage, but this only provides further proof of just how pervasive homophobic hostility was in society. The rights of LGBTQ people are in no way inherent to Western values. For the vast majority of its history, the Western world has shunned and demonized non-heteronormative people. We went over to China and called them immoral for their acceptance of homosexuality. We imperialized them and exported our homophobia to their society, which remains there to this day. We then, in the last 20 or 30 years, have seen gay rights activism very effectively advance the cause of LGBTQ acceptance in the West. Now that we have very recently come to openly embrace support for gay rights, we act as though this is evidence of our inherently superior moral values and condemn nations out of step with these values, when in reality, China adopted the homophobic values of the West, and we came to express values more closely aligned with the tolerance for homosexuality of pre-imperial China. This context demonstrates that no matter what Western values are perceived to be at any one time, the Western world will always consider their values to be superior and will push Oriental nations to catch up with them. For a final example, this dynamic can also be observed in Western discourses around Islamic dress codes. Many Muslim countries enforce oppressive norms around the policing of women's bodies. Western chauvinists take advantage of this, and people who don't support feminist causes within their own countries are all of a sudden very concerned with the rights of women in Muslim contexts.
First and foremost, I think we need to look at human rights, okay? In 1998, there was the Human Rights Convention, okay? Under Article 9, it specifically says we all have the freedom of expression, we have the freedom of belief, we have the freedom of so many things that, you know, like in this country, I thought great...
Mariam,
like,
can I just point out,
well,
can I just point out, there is something
fundamentally ludicrous about somebody dressed as you are talking the language of modern human rights?
Absolutely.
What's a bit fundamentally ludicrous?
That's in your mind. That's in your mind.
Human rights here are used to distinguish liberal Western societies as furthering the rights of women, where Islamic societies oppress them. This, though, is a hugely misleading oversimplification. Patriarchy has been a mode of oppression in virtually every society. Women didn't gain rights in the West because Western patriarchal elites just decided that women should be equal. Women gained rights through virtue of feminist resistance and agitation, sometimes violent agitation. In 1913, English suffragettes concocted a strategy of targeting sporting stadiums for vandalism as zones of male cultural power. Most attempts were foiled, but they succeeded in burning down a stand of the Manor Ground Stadium, home to Arsenal Football Club at the time. People looking to defend the West's record on women's rights are always neglecting the fact that every right has been fought for and won by women, not just granted to them by a benevolent system of liberal democracy. We were calling ourselves democracies before women could even vote. How does that make any sense?
Out of tune with some deep sentiments in this country.
Yeah, well, you've been a democracy for like 50 years, so...
What? No, I mean, well, okay.
No, not unless you don't count black people, which is kind of a bad habit, so you... Okay.
Women didn't get the vote because of a dynamic of inevitable moral progress that results from Western thought, as Western liberals love to conceive of it. They won the vote through sustained action against the patriarchal system, a system which is still in place today, but which will always be one step ahead of the Islamic world so that focus will be drawn in their direction rather than in a direction of self-reflection. Arya Nakisa draws on Palestinian-American anthropologist Laila Abu-Lughod, saying, "Liberal capitalism encourages women to embrace an individualistic lifestyle of consumerism and sexual freedom, sustained through purchases of clothing and cosmetics designed to enhance sexual attractiveness. By contrast, traditional Islamic Bedouin norms restrict female sexual freedom with the aim of protecting marriage and kinship bonds, thereby reinforcing a particular system of power." Abu-Lughod observes that when Bedouin women purchase Western clothing and cosmetics, they are resisting subverting Islamic Bedouin norms in a manner encouraged by liberal capitalism. For Abu-Lughod, such resistance or subversion does not signify opposition to power in general, but rather opposition to one system of power in favour of another. What Abu-Lughod means here is that when we in the West are pushing for reforms in Muslim societies, we are often doing so in ways that reinforce our own system of powers, methods of control. Malala Yousafzai, after being shot by the Taliban in Pakistan at age 11, protesting for the rights of girls to have an education, was granted asylum to the UK. Interviewed in The Guardian, she speaks on her surprise on finding that the UK was not the ideal standard for gender equality she had been led to believe it was. Surprised and shocked, she says, to discover how far Britain is from having gender equality. As a child, she had assumed that equal access to education here would mean there was a wider equality. The Western world is viewed as an ideal for other countries, especially developing countries in terms of development, progress, and gender equality. There are things I have seen here which I value and appreciate, but there is still a lot of work to be done on the representation of women in Parliament, or if you look at the equal pay issue or the sexual harassment issue, there are so many issues that the UK still needs to fight against to achieve equality. If you look at how women are portrayed in movies, films, or ads, they are viewed as these delicate bodies who should dress in a certain way, behave in a certain way, talk in a certain way. This is something we have to challenge. It is women who should be deciding what they want to wear, what they want to say, what they want to do. It should not be someone else's job to tell us how to dress, how to talk, how to walk.
Just think what you're dealing with. The majesty and grandeur of the English language is the greatest possession we have. The noblest thoughts that ever flowed through the hearts of men are contained in its extraordinary, imaginative, and musical mixtures of sounds. And that's what you've set yourself out to conquer, Eliza. And conquer it you will.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
Again.
In reference to discussions around banning burqas or the bikini in some Western societies, she says, "I believe it's a woman's right to decide what she wants to wear, and if a woman can go to the beach and wear nothing, then why can't she also wear everything?" Malala is pointing out that despite the freedoms women have in the West that they cannot take for granted in Muslim countries, Western norms around female gender expectations and beauty standards are still a restrictive mechanism that disempower women in Western countries. Seeking to westernize the Muslim world in the name of relieving female oppression will only be swapping one form of female disempowerment for another. Feminist Islamic theologian Rafat Hassan grounds the aspiration for human rights and gender equality within the Quran itself. She argues through her work that all Abrahamic religions have been used as a basis for justifying patriarchal power relations, but that these justifications have been made on erroneous grounds, and that the Quran can be interpreted such that God created both men and women for a just purpose, and that the relationship between them is one of equality, mutuality, and cordiality. It has been the major mission of my life to educate Muslim Pakistani girls and women about the rights given to them by God in the Quran. An approach to women's rights that is grounded in the cultural context of the relevant society is far more likely to resonate with those it seeks to empower. It can also avoid the attacks of the oppressive forces of patriarchal Islam that claims the direction of travel towards women's liberation is serving the interests of Western imperial culture. In Against the Web, Michael Brooks draws on Indian economist Amartya Sen to argue for a global, culturally diverse view of human rights struggle. Amartya Sen, who in response to the usual Eurocentric claim that the tradition that produced human rights flowed from Greece through Rome through Europe to America, countered that rather than a story of cultural continuity, the struggle for human dignity has always been fragmented, multicultural, and global. The West's history is hardly an unbroken chain of progress towards social equality. Instead of inaccurately particularizing the concepts of rights and justice as Western, we should understand that the fight for social equality and justice has arisen in various forms in a variety of cultures from ancient to modern times. In this conception, human rights are in no way unique to a Western system of thought, and it is not Western tradition that should become universal to spread human rights and supplant illiberal systems of thought. Rather, the universal struggle for human dignity that exists within all traditions should be recognized and encouraged in a culturally pluralist world that seeks respect for all human beings as well as respect for cultural diversity. In Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, a classic text of decolonial literature, Fanon writes, "Every time Western values are mentioned, they produce in the native a sort of stiffening or muscular lockjaw. He is offered definite values. He is told frequently that decolonization need not mean regression, and that he must put his trust in qualities which are well-tried, solid, and highly esteemed. The violence with which the supremacy of white values is affirmed, and the aggressiveness which has permeated the victory of these values over the ways of life and thought of the native, mean that in revenge, the native laughs in mockery when Western values are mentioned in front of him. In the colonial context, the settler only ends his work of breaking in the native when the latter admits loudly and intelligibly the supremacy of the white man's values." Fanon expresses the resentment felt by legions of colonized populations towards the Western values that we deem to be of moral superiority, but which their experience tells them have been used to supplant their own ways of life and oppress them in service of our own interests. Struggles for human rights in non-Western contexts will only be harmed by discourse that contends that human rights are synonymous with Western values. Western values have been a tool for legitimizing oppression of non-Western populations, and will never be considered suitable for non-Western paradigms. If they are seen to be imposed from an outside power like the Western world, then they will be vehemently resisted. So in these dark times, is there any hope for football to escape the tug-of-war between capitalist elites who want it to remain the intellectual property of Western soft power, and oil-rich authoritarian sovereign wealth funds from the East looking to assert themselves on the world stage?
That boy is our last hope.
No. There is another.
Luton Town FC have just won promotion to the Premier League, going from playing non-league football only 10 years ago. One of the most cinematic turnaround stories of football history. 20 years ago, Luton was acquired by a scummy little rat-fuck property developer named John Gurney.
Nobody would get involved with a football club if it wasn't a good business deal. And yes, some supporters are passionate about their clubs. But at the end of the day, it's business.
The early 2000s was a particularly tough time for lower league football fans. Wimbledon FC relocated over 50 miles away from its supporter base to Milton Keynes, where they became the MK Dons, severing the link between the club and the community that spawned it. Wrexham, who are now beginning their ascent from non-league football with the big money approach, were at the time in an eviction battle with their owner Alex Hamilton, who wanted to dismantle the team, demolish the stadium and build a racecourse he could sell. It became evident to the Luton supporters that John Gurney did not represent the interests of the fans, but rather sought to leverage the club's property assets for his own financial interest.
John Gurney has big dreams for Luton. They're centred on this prime site near the M1 motorway and Luton Airport.
The reason why we bought the football club was primarily this piece of land, and it's hoped that we'll move the football club too. And the stadium and other developments which are undecided at the moment, which could be hotels, convention centres, retail shopping, will go on the top.
I don't think any football club anywhere in the country has the land that is available to Luton to redevelop on, and it's the intention for Luton Town Football Club, or London Luton as it might then be known, to take the eventual development profits.
It's Thursday, payday, and back at the club, the wages haven't been paid.
In a succession-esque manoeuvre, Luton supporters devised a plan for a stealth takeover. They formed the Luton Town Supporters Trust and established strong links with the community. They convinced supporters to boycott the sale of season tickets, starving the club of revenue. They asked supporters instead to invest in the trust, which would use the funds on the down low to buy up shares in the club's holding company. The holding company, unbeknownst to John Gurney at the time of his purchase, was owed millions of dollars by the club, and this debt could be called in at any time.
The situation was that Hatters Holdings, over a period of years, had loaned Luton Town several £1 million. So we managed to acquire shares in Hatters Holdings itself, which then enabled us to call in that debt, which of course we knew Luton Town couldn't pay, but it enabled us to appoint an administrative receiver, which would then take control away from the football club from John Gurney.
Well, the people in the trust have made a very big mistake, because I never walk away from a fight, and if they expect me to walk away from Luton with nothing, I'll make very sure there's nothing to walk away from.
But the cunning football fans won their club back. It wasn't all smooth sailing from there though. Various dodgy dealings from the owner who took over after John Gurney saw the club's finances come under heavy scrutiny from regulators. Large point deductions were applied to their league standings in 2 consecutive seasons, which saw them relegated from third-tier football down into the shadowy underworld of non-league football. However, while the club was flailing financially, the Supporters Trust gradually became a greater and greater influence embedded in the ownership structure of the club. The trust has veto power over all image rights for the club. They are in control of its identity, its name, its kit, its crest, its stadium name, and all sponsorship associations. No other English team's fans has this kind of control.
Potential owners of football clubs have got to realise that they can't really meddle with fans' emotions and loyalty. This is the badge, this is the history of Luton Town Football Club. It's over 100 years old, and we will protect that history for as long as we live.
The trust has seats on the board and 50,000 shares in the company. While it would be premature to call this a fully fan-owned club with a majority of shares still in individual private hands, this structure is by far the most progressive in English football, and the trust does have real power in the operations of the club. In their own words, a supporters trust is a formal, democratic, non-profit organisation run by fans for fans. In a way, we're like a union. This is exactly the direction football ownership needs to move in, having actual capacity for fan decision making. If a union protects workers from bosses, then a supporters trust protects fans from owners. In Archer et al.'s pearl-clutching paper on sports washing, they advocate a strategy of resistance. One can stop participating in the practice that is being used by the sports washer. Fans can boycott their team or a particular competition. Fans of Newcastle United or Chelsea, for example, might point out that they had no say in who would take over the ownership of their club, and are not the ones who determine who is deemed to pass the English Premier League's fit and proper person test for becoming a director or owner of a football club. A boycott, yeah, that'll work. Boycott the sovereign wealth fund of an oil nation. Boycotting worked for Luton, a cash-starved club. Are Newcastle fans going to convince the entire world to transition to renewable energy to starve the Saudi regime of oil revenue? Because that's the only way you're going to have a financial impact on them. The answer isn't for less fan participation in the form of boycotts, it's for greater fan participation. Supporter trusts, acting as unions, enacting the will of the fans, and preventing the corporate ownership from treating the club as a commodity, rather than a source of communal significance. The fans of Newcastle, Chelsea, or any other team are exactly the right people to determine through a democratic process who is fit and proper to have a financial stake in their club. In addition to seats on the board of their respective clubs, supporters' trust should also be given representation in football's governing bodies. Only genuine supporter-led regulation can halt the rapid financialization and commodification of the game that is inhibiting fair competition and tilting the balance in favor of corporate elites, oligarchs, and sovereign wealth. The Western media cries sports washing in the defense of the financial interests of their own elites, who can't compete with the oil monopolies and fear the Western world will lose its place as the hegemon of soft power. Considering that soft power co-opts people to want the same as you and generate attraction for one's values, culture, and policies, it is not sports themselves that is the engine of Qatari soft power, but money. Qatar's successful sports strategy does not lie strictly in the matter of sports, but in abundant economic resources efficiently invested in sports. What Soyland and Morricone identify here is that contrary to the belief of Joseph Nye, the founding theorist of soft power, democratic Western values and high ideals are not necessary in order to generate soft power. If you have the money to invest, it can be generated regardless of political or ideological structure. The media and liberal theorists who are simply interested in maintaining the status quo prior to Middle Eastern investment, whereby football was the playground for Western capital, are not interested in greater fan autonomy over the game. The unanimous rejection of the Super League by fans who protested their own club's participation in a competition that would have put even greater distance between the clubs and their local contexts, while generating more wealth for the owners, provides a glimpse of the capacity for radical potential within Premier League football. Fan collective action prevented a huge shift towards monopoly. If Luton Town can beat the odds once again and have a strong first season in the Premier League, maybe the fans who stood against the Super League will resonate with the power the Luton Supporters Trust has over the running of their club. Maybe we could see the emergence of fan consciousness as a class position. Football has historically been a sport of the working class. Now its commodification has led to domination by the business elite. Capitalists of all varieties, including Western ones, have for too long mistreated the fans who generate their wealth, and suppressed the fans' desires for power over their club and its identity. If anyone wants to stop the corrosive influence of money in football, the only possible mechanism for doing this is through strong, democratic fan ownership structures. In conclusion, if we're going to commit to using the term sports washing, then it needs to be applied non-selectively to all states involved in sports, including Western ones, and used to highlight their human rights abuses. Though an understanding of soft power, as discussed in international relations theory, is a far more useful framework. The world's a fucked up place, and we're either complicit in all of it or none of it, not just the crimes of states we don't like. If anything, we're far more complicit in our own state's crimes. Human rights are not synonymous with Western values. The struggle for human dignity has always been fragmented, multicultural, and global. And finally, give fans power and ownership over the clubs and sports they love. They'll treat them with more respect and importance than elites using them for financial or reputational interests.